Hello, students, and welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about federalism and this relationship that the national government has with state and local governments. And this is really important, and it builds on our conversation from Chapter 2 as we discussed the Constitution and the drafting and the implementation, ratification of the Constitution. When we talk about the Constitution and the framework for the government in the United States was created, we talk a lot about separation of powers and checks and balances and where the authority lies to make rules, right? So that was very important to the framers to decide, right? Where does the power lie? How is that power checked, right? That was a big concern. We saw that, right? When the colonists that's what the colonists fought a revolutionary war over, was their freedom because of what they felt was a tyrannical government, right? British government. So they wanted to ensure in the system of self-governance that power would be controlled, right? And they wanted to make sure, as we saw with the Articles of Confederation, a lot of that power was focused, if not all the power was focused at the local level or the state level within the colonies, right? When the country was operating under the Articles of Confederation, that's how it worked. The power was focused at the state level. The national government didn't really have any power. The only power the national government had was what the states or the colonies would give them, what would give the national government, and that was very little, right? So the national government couldn't raise taxes, couldn't raise revenue, couldn't really provide for protection of the country, couldn't even put down simple rebellions, as we talked about Shays' Rebellion. So there was a lot of weaknesses in this system, but it's important to remember why the Articles of Confederation came about. It was important to prevent the national government from becoming too powerful and overburdening and tyrannical. So the colonies knew what they had dealt with previously, and they wanted to prevent that from happening again, right? So they had this confederal system to start, right? This bottom-up approach. The power was within the colonies, and the colonies gave any power to the national government. So, right, so a very bottom-up approach. That's compared to a unitary system. In the colonists, the framers knew they did not want a unitary system of government. This centralized, a unitary system where power is centralized at the national level, policy was made at the national level, and then those decisions were filtered out to the states, right? So that was out, right? That was never going to happen. That constitution written with a unitary system was never going to pass because there was concerns that there would be no public policy decisions made at the state and local level. And based on the different subcultures, even at that time, and the different elements of what was important to each colony, they were afraid that those decisions were going to be taken away if it was just decisions were made at the national level. So what's the solution, right? A confederal system made the national government too weak, especially with a country in its infancy that needed to protect itself from outside invaders, and even inside, protect themselves against rebellions. So how are we going to do this, right? And we don't want a unitary system, so we have to kind of strike some balance, and that's why our system of government was created, was built in with a federal system. So what is a federal system? It's the structure in which power, right, is not just at the local level, it's not all at the national level. There's shared powers between the national government and the local government. So the framers had the difficult task of trying to decide what the national government had to have. What were the express powers the national government needed to have, and what powers needed to be reserved to the state. So that was an important discussion about not only what powers would be at each level of government, but how those decisions would be made, and when decisions, if there was conflict, where decisions could ultimately be made if there was conflicts between national law and state law. So you see this within the Constitution. You see the express powers of the national government. We see it in Article 1, Section 8. We talk about express powers being to tax, to borrow, to regulate commerce, interstate commerce. So that's really important. So we call those express powers. They're expressed. They're clearly expressed within the US Constitution. But then we have implied powers, right? And this is an important component because not everything, if you look at the Constitution, it's a relatively simple document. Not all the powers are laid out or are expressed and clearly expressed in the Constitution. But the framers were smart enough and had enough forethought to put in the necessary and proper clause to deal with these called implied powers, right? So you had express powers, but what did the Congress, what did the national government need to do? What was implied for them to carry out their express powers, right? So if you had the power to tax, right? Do you need to create banks? What do you need to do? What was necessary and proper to be able to tax, to borrow? What's necessary and proper to be able to regulate interstate commerce? So we've seen a lot of times, we've seen this necessary and proper clause used to justify regulating things like interstate commerce. So Congress has justified laws that they've passed under the necessary and proper clause. And we call that the elastic clause because they're stretching, right, expanding the power of the national government, right? And the courts have stepped in from time to time to say, yes, this is related to the express powers or that Congress has overreached. So the courts have played a significant role in deciding, right, when that power of the national government can be expanded or retracted. So that's very important, right? Remember, express powers and implied powers, along with those three different structures of government, right? Unitary, confederal, and our system, a federal system, right? So when you hear federal, I don't want you thinking, federal government. I want you thinking federal, meaning shared power within the national and sub-national governments, or the states and local governments, right? So express powers for the national government. Well, what about the states? So the powers that the states have, we see in the 10th Amendment. We call them reserved powers, right? So when you read the 10th Amendment, it says that any powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states or to the people, right? So are reserved, right? So the states reserve that power. So the framers were trying to say, okay, we know what the national government needs to be able to do to protect the country. And if it's not one of those, or we say the states can't do it, those powers are reserved to the states. So those are really important concepts. I want you to remember as you move forward throughout this course, because we will talk about these concepts moving forward as we talk about specific public policy issues. But it's extremely important to understand how those apply, because in another video, we're going to talk about kind of this ebb and flow of federalism, right, of states' powers, because, right, federalism is really a theory, right? It was a theory of the framers of how to divide up power. And then it can be much different based on practical circumstances. So when you put federalism into practice and you deal with outside context, right? Environmental issues, economic downturns, natural disasters, right? Federalism can take on a much different look than maybe it was anticipated. So within this system, now we talk about checks and balances, right? Within our structure within the United States, but we typically talk about checks and balances at one level of government, right? The legislature checks the executive and the judiciary, and around we go. Well, within the system of our federal system, we have what we call, so when you check across one layer of government, right? Legislature checks executive, that's called horizontal checks and balances. But in our system, we also have vertical checks and balances, right? So we have a vertical check right now, even today, right? The federal government, right? The DOJ is suing the state of Texas, or plans to sue the state of Texas over their new abortion law, right? So that's a check that the federal government is placing on the state government. And we'll see how that plays out within the courts. And it goes the other way too. Think about President Biden's announced rules about employers and vaccine mandates or mandated testing. Several states have already vowed to sue the federal government, sue the Biden administration over those new rules. So we call that vertical checks. The states can check the national government, and the federal government, the national government, can check the state government. Okay. All right. So one last point, and then we'll wrap up this video. It's important to understand we have multiple relationships going on, right? Typically, we think in our federal system, well, there's a relationship to states to the national government and vice versa. But we also have to look at interstate relations. So now we have these 50 states, and there's relationships within the different states. So you have to look, and it's important. So make sure you read about the full faith and credit clause, the privileges and immunities clause, interstate extradition, and interstate compacts, right? And these are important because it lays out in the Constitution the relationship between the states, right? The fact that one state has to recognize, deeds and wills and other contracts from other states, right? Just because you move from one state to another doesn't void contracts that you previously signed that were legally signed in other states, right? Privileges and immunities are very important, right? We travel. We're allowed to travel from any state. We can come and go as we please. So it's built into the Constitution that if we go to one state that's outside our home state, that state has to treat us just like they would treat the citizens of their own state, right? They can't treat us differently. They can't discriminate against us because we're from another state. Interstate extradition is very important, right? This agreement within the Constitution that criminals can't commit crimes in one state and then flee to another state and be free from being held accountable, right? Those states have to agree to extradite that criminal so they can stand trial for the things that they have done, right? And then interstate compacts, right? We have problems in this country that aren't necessary, that one locality, one city, or one state can't deal with or don't want to deal with. Think about in the Great Lakes area, right? You have multiple states surrounding different lakes. There could be pollution problems, a variety of different environmental problems that need to be solved. So how can we do that? Well, states can come together and provide resources such as, funds or knowledge about how to solve problems, and they can work together to solve whatever problem could be impacting all of those particular states. Now, typically, these interstate compacts, if they're addressing trying to address problems that are regional, but don't put one state at a disadvantage over another, Congress doesn't necessarily get involved. However, if there's ever a compact in which there are power shifts, right? Because of a compact, a state is put at an advantage that the other state or states do not have, then those have to be vetted by Congress and approved. So another check on these compacts within states as well. So we see this different regulation, or the different organization of, like I said, not just relationships at different levels of government, but across the different states as well. And that's very important. So why federalism? Well, that's very important. Why federalism? Okay. Why federalism? Let's talk about the benefits and the arguments against federalism. So federalism has been beneficial because the different states and different localities can try different things, right? When it comes to public policy implementation, how do you improve schools? How do you get better trained police? How do you improve response time for the fire department? How do you improve higher education, right? Think about this. We call them laboratories of democracy. If you have 50 states working on how to improve these things, all right, well, you have better odds of finding systems and programs that work, as opposed to just one national government trying a program, seeing how it works, filtering it out across 50 states, and then saying, okay, it's not perfect. Let's go back to the drawing board. Let's try to do it again. You're doing this one at a time. But now you could have 50 states trying to solve these problems in these laboratories of democracy, and other states can see the struggles of other states, and they can see their successes and try to stay away from those failures and implement those those successes and try to improve their own situations in their own states, right? So another benefit of federalism is the recognition of different political subcultures, right? We have a lot of civil discourse in this country. And what is that over? About things that matter to us. The reason we're arguing about them is because it matters, right? And we talk about the kind of rudimentary system of red states, blue states, right? That's an oversimplified idea, but it's relevant because we see what the different cultures are in these different states and different localities. And federalism allows different states to carry out public policy based on the culture within their states or their regions, okay? And if other states disagree, they can, when we're talking about other states disagree, the citizenry, the majority of the citizens in that state agree with a different policy, that state can go a different direction, okay? A lot of times we nationalize these public policy debates, but I can't help but wonder if we kept those public policy decisions for these very contentious issues at the state level, maybe these issues wouldn't be as contentious. But but that leads to a next question: what are some disadvantages of federalism? Right? We talk about as far as having different states with different political subcultures and kind of voting with your feet, going to live where you might agree with the policy, but right? Should we have to, right? What are the kind of the disadvantages of federalism, right? And some of these disadvantages are that sometimes powerful states and local interests may block progress of a national issue or national plans. And I think there's some concern about that and that's an argument people make when you say, well, we don't want a Texas to be able to impede this, or the conservative states. We don't want liberal states to impede our progress for this particular policy, right? So when you have an opportunity to have a national policy, you don't want some larger states to impede what you argue is progress, all right? So, and then there's also concern of inequities across states in terms of policies, spending on services like education and crime prevention. So what, is there less money for education in Mississippi than New York, right? Is there more spending in Florida for crime prevention versus New Jersey, right? So if Florida has more money or another state has more money to spend on these things, are there inequities created from other states that don't have the resources that larger states, more populated states, more industrial states have, right? So it's important to think about the benefits and disadvantages of federalism, because those are the things that we're still talking about today. We talk about them when it comes to abortion, to gun rights, to marijuana, right, to infrastructure, right? Where does the national government stop? Where does their power end? Where does state government's power begin? And we're going to continue to have those conversations because, again, our system doesn't operate in a bubble, right? There's external forces that influence the relationships of the different levels of government in our system. So we'll talk about that in another video. Please make sure to continue reading. And if you have any questions, reach out. And I hope you all have a great day. Take care.